Alright, hello everyone, this is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I'm about to start a series of slide presentations for Murachs HTML5 and CSS3 3rd edition, which is the textbook, or one of the two textbooks, for the AWD1000 Web Technologies class. Chapter 1, as you can see, is an introduction to web development. As we look at our objectives here, we want to be able to load a web page from the internet or an intranet into a browser, view source code, describe the typical components of a web app, be able to distinguish between the internet and an intranet, describe the entire HTTP or Hypertext Transfer Protocol process, including HTTP requests and HTTP responses. Be able to distinguish between static and dynamic web pages and how the web server processes both. Name the current 5 major web browsers. Describe the use of JavaScript, and be able to distinguish between HTML, the hypertext markup language, and CSS cascading style sheets. Explain how to deploy a website on the internet. Describe the different components of a hypertext transfer protocol, uniform resource locator, or a URL, and describe 5 different issues involved with website development, including usability, cross-browser compatibility, user accessibility, search engine optimization, also known as SEO, and responsive web design. So, the author shows this as being the components of a web application, and it's kind of funny because if you look, the internet is pretty much shown as a cloud. And when we talk about the cloud today, that's pretty much what we're talking about. All right? The way this has changed over time is this used to just say desktop computer, desktop computer, desktop computer. But now, as you can see, we've got a desktop. There could be a laptop here, but we also have tablets and smartphones. In fact, as of 2015, more people use the internet based off of tablets or smartphones, in other words, some kind of a mobile device, than do desktop and laptop. All right, but this stuff all goes in, so we make requests. Those requests end up going out to a web server or servers that answer the request, send it back as HTML, and it goes back to our machines. It's pretty much the way it is. And when you look at this, this is the architecture of the internet. Now, a couple things that you see on here. You see a few things that say, or at least a few, I guess, that say WAN. That's a wide area network. For instance, I work at the Wentzville campus for Rankin Technical College. We are about 40 miles away from the Rankin Technical College St. Louis campus. We don't have a direct connection because they'd have to put it under the road or something like that. But we have an indirect connection that's through a WAN, a wide area network. So a wide area network is oftentimes used when you want to be able to connect sites that you can't physically make a location to. So for instance, if you've got, let's say, MasterCard or Amazon or somebody with sites all over the world, they would have a wide area network connection. A LAN is a local area network. For instance, I'm in a classroom right now with about 26 computers in it. They are all physically connected to one another through a local area network. So the local implies an actual physical connection, typically at least, and that's a LAN, and a WAN, a wide area network, implies some kind of a connection via routers or signals. Now, this is a static web page. What that means is this web page will always look the same unless the user goes and brings the web page up in his or her editor and changes it. Then once they do and they save it, it'll look the same with the new changes. But you can always tell a static web page because it has either a .html or a .htm extension. When you're working with a static web page, as it says, the web server gets this hypertext transfer protocol request, HTTP request, that comes from the client, which is typically you at a machine, be it a mobile device, a laptop, a desktop, a phone, whatever. and you end up sending this out. So you key in some kind of a URL, .html, it goes to a web server. The web server provides HTML back in the form of a hypertext transfer protocol response that goes back again to the client machine. Now here's an example of a dynamic web page. A dynamic web page does not end in .html. Typically it ends in .php or .asp, .aspx or .jsp or something like that. In other words, since it's dynamic, it can change all the time, and you would have to. If I decided that I wanted to order 2 copies of this, I would have to be able to go in there, click the quantity down arrow here, and change it from a 1 to a 2. If I wanted to be able to put it in my cart, I'd have to click here, etc. So with a dynamic web page, the big difference here is typically there are several servers involved. But you see, we still have the same HTTP request to a web server. Although other things are done, we still have the web server giving back HTTP response as HTML. But again, there may be one or more servers involved in this. In other words, previously the web server did virtually everything. Now the web server is kind of a conduit, and it passes the request off to an application server and or a database server. The 5 most popular browsers in the world right now are the ones shown on the screen. For years, and you may have heard about, in the 80s, I think it was, the browser wars, the 80s or 90s, there were just 2. There was Internet Explorer, all right, and there was Netscape. Netscape kind of has morphed into Firefox and really a little bit of Safari also. Chrome was the underdog for years because basically Internet Explorer, IE, kind of ate everything else up. But Chrome has kind of taken over now. They've got the biggest market share. IE is second, and one of the reasons IE is second is anytime a Windows machine is sold, you've got IE on it by default. Firefox is third. Firefox is known for its extensive toolkit library, and it uses the WebKit engine. So does Safari. Safari, one of the reasons it's number 4 is whereas IE is given free on Windows machines, Safari is given for free on Macs. And you also have Opera. All right. When you do work with a server-side scripting language, here are some examples. I gave you the first 3. Those are the only, well, I shouldn't say that. I have worked with ASP.NET, JSP, PHP, Ruby, Perl, and Python. So all of them except I have never worked with Cold Fusion. Now, why do you want the ability to have dynamicity, a dynamic web page? Well, here's an example of what you might want to be able to do. They talk about image swaps and rollovers. Maybe this is a great example because it's not, with the way that these are set up, it's not an interactive example. But maybe you've seen this in the past where I have at least. You go out to a site that's Nutrisystem or something like that, and they've got a picture of somebody who's maybe heavier set. You take your mouse and you put it on there, and the picture changes, it morphs into them having lost a lot of weight. That's what's called a rollover. So when you go into it, it's got one picture. When you leave it, it's got another one. All right? And that's pretty much the way that swaps work too, that where you can swap images in and out. So how does JavaScript fit into this architecture? Well, JavaScript can be used in 2 ways. It can be used either on the client side, and that's where still the majority of JavaScript is used. But JavaScript today can also be used, it can be used basically on the client side, but it can also be used on the server side. All right? So why do you want to use JavaScript on the client side? The biggest one is what's shown there in number 1, data validation. All right? And that is you want to be able to validate information that you enter in or a user enters in on a form, and you want to validate it on the client side, because once you click that submit button, if you don't validate it on the client side, it gets sent out to a server someplace. The server is probably already very busy, And if there's mistakes in the form, it's not really, shouldn't be the server's responsibility to find them. You should find them on the client side, have the user fix them, and resend them. The image swaps and rollovers I've already gone over with you. I don't know if you've ever seen an example of an accordion before, but like an FAQ page that has a bunch of questions on it, you click the question and boom, a paragraph of information appears down below it to answer that question. That's an example of an accordion. Now this is the kind of code that you're going to write here. I don't expect it to make a whole heck of a lot of sense, but you'll see at the top here you've got a Doctype line. That tells the type of document you're working with. This used to be very long-winded and you had to type in a lot, but with HTML5 and HTML 5.1, which are the current versions basically of HTML, this is all you need. Then you've got a beginning HTML tag and an ending HTML tag. You notice that all tags are within less than and greater than signs. All right. The lang equals en is not mandatory, but it's often added, meaning that the language you're using is English. It should default to that anyway if you leave it out, but it's considered good practice to put that in. Then inside of your HTML tags, which are kind of the bookends for your document, you've got beginning and ending head tags, beginning and ending body tags. The stuff that goes in the head tag does not appear on the web page itself. It's extra information that the browser may need, such as the first tag there says it's what's called a meta tag. Meta meaning data about data. And it says the character set that we are using for this is UTF-8, which I believe is like Universal Transformation Format or something. And I believe that's a shortcut for saying we're using the Unicode character set. More on that later. Title, Dreamweaver book. If you've ever looked up on the top here, not on this slide, but on the top, if you're on a website and you see you've got a bunch of tabs open, the tab for this page will say Dreamweaver book. The stuff that's in the body is what actually does appear on the web page. First, you've got an H1 tag. There are 6 levels of these tags: H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. As the number goes up, the font size of the tag gets smaller. Typically, you only have one H1 tag per web page, and it should have basically your main designation for the page. So you can see this says Dreamweaver CC 2014, and there it is. Then we have what's called an image tag, IMG, short for image. And what is shown in here are the 2 things that are considered to be required. These are what are called attributes for the image tag. The first attribute is source, the second attribute is alt. The source is the name of the file that you want to show. It's the actual image file itself. Notice it's within double quotes. You can use single quotes, but most people tend to use double quotes for these. The other one says alt. Let's say that I had accidentally typed in here, instead of Dreamweaver book, I had typed Dreamweaver Bach, and I typed in B-O-K instead of B-O-O-K. Then in the alt tag, what would show here instead of this is you would see the text Dreamweaver book. So the alt tag is used if you make a mistake here. It's also used by people who use the website who might be blind. So a screen reader could read the alt tag to them. All right, and it's considered standard practice and really virtually required practice today. You have to put in a source tag, but it's considered pretty much standard practice today to also put in an alt tag. Then you have 2 paragraphs worth of text. Notice that the paragraphs are delineated between P tags, and for virtually all of these tags, H1/H1, P/P, etc. Here will be an A tag /A, body/body, head/head, HTML/HTML. There is no ending tag for Doctype. So these are 2 paragraphs that are being put in here. All right. And you'll notice with this second paragraph, it's got what's called an anchor tag, which says, I'm going to provide for you a hypertext reference. That read more ... That's this right over here. A little long-winded, but just so you hear it. So this is the HTML that would be displayed in the browser. If when that page came up, you right mouse clicked on the page, there would be an option there to view the page source, and it would pretty much look like this then. Now that's fine, but when you create a web page like this, there's no styling put in it whatsoever, other than whatever styling the browser puts in. Maybe you'd rather take that text and put it over here instead of putting it down below, for example. And to do that, you use what's called a cascading style sheet. This example right here would allow you to add a cascading style sheet called book.cs, all right, into your document. This means you're linking it to the document. The relationship is it's a style sheet. The hypertext reference is it says go out and find a file that's in the same folder I'm in that's called book.css. Here's an example of an HTML style sheet. Notice the difference between this right here and this right here. We have taken the text that was down here and moved it up here. We put a border around this. We took the Dreamweaver that's here and changed the color. How did we do that? Well, these are what are referred to as style rules. This says all the text that's in the body here, unless told otherwise, will have a font family of Arial if that exists on the user's computer. If it doesn't, then use Helvetica. And if that doesn't exist, all right, use sans serif, which virtually every computer has. The font size should be 100% of its normal size. The width of the page should be 550 pixels. This says that this should be centered on the page, so you notice the centering. This talks about padding, and we'll get into padding, but it's going to be the area that you have in here. Don't worry about it for now. And it also says we want a 1 pixel solid navy border. That's what you see around here. All right. Next, we have an H1 tag. And again, we have no margin, so the margin is set to 0. We have a little bit of padding. All right. The font size is going to be double its normal size at 200%, and we want it to be navy. All right. We're saying that the image, we want it to float to the left, and we want it to have no top margin, 1M right margin, 1M bottom margin, and 1M left margin. Finally, for all the paragraphs that are in here, we want there to be no margin, but at the bottom, we want 5 M's or half an M of padding. Now, that may not make a lot of sense right now, but that's okay. It really and truly is, because this is what the whole class is about. So this is how it's going to appear in the browser. All right. Now, there have been many releases of HTML. The ones that we are concerned with in this class are the last two. All right. HTML went from 1 to 2 to 4 to 4.01. Then it kind of died for a while, and XHTML came up with 1 and 1.1. But then people said XHTML ain't cutting it. So let's go back to HTML. So they've been version 5, and the newest is version 5.1, which just adds some extra features and functionality to version 5. CSS has gone through the same thing with the latest release being version 3. Two websites that they say you should become familiar with are w3.org, which is the World Wide Web Consortium, and whatwdwg.org, which is the Hypertext Application Technology Working Group. These two groups are the two that actually did get together and pretty much created HTML5 as we know it. Now, they talk in here about Aptana, and they recommend that you use Aptana for your work in here. I'm not going to make a recommendation one way or the other, but I'm going to show you several different editors and IDEs or integrated development environments that you can use, and I'm going to let you make your own designation. So I'm not going to go over that at all. Here's some other ones. I'm going to show you Aptana. I'm going to show you brackets. I'm going to show you Notepad++. I'm not going to show you TextMate because I believe that's for a Mac, but I am going to show you also Atom and probably VS or Visual Studio Code as well. So this is how you do things in Aptana. Again, I'm not going to go through that. Here are some popular IDEs. Again, I will show you a version of Visual Studio that's called Visual Studio Code, but I'm not going to show you, not in this class, any of the other ones. All right. We will eventually, and I will show you how to do this also in class, use Filezilla. And you will create at the end of each semester. So you'll start at the end of your first semester, but you will update or upgrade this every semester. All right, an electronic portfolio that you will create on your home machine. Then you will upload it to the Rankin server. So you'll be able, anyone who's got an internet connection will be able to do that. We will use Filezilla. So we'll have to put in our host, which will be iwt.rankin.edu. Your username, which will typically be your first initial and your last name, your password, which I will set for you, and a random port, which I believe is 21. You'll click Quick Connect. Then if you imagine this being split here, this will be your machine, this will be your account on the Rankin machine, and you can drag files from one to the other. All right, we're going to use Filezilla, but there are other programs. There's even more than the one shown here. Okay. Most people have used URLs at one time or another, but probably the majority of those people do not know the components of a URL. So that's what's shown here. The HTTP:// is the protocol. It stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. Typically, it'll be one of three things. HTTP, again, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. HTTPS, which is a Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure, or FTP, which stands for File Transfer Protocol. All right, so it's the protocol that you're using for this. Oftentimes when you key in a site, you can leave the HTTP:// off. Not always, but oftentimes. www for World Wide Web, and then this is the domain name. This is the path, and typically if you want to open up index.html, you can either put that in or leave it off. This will show you a static, not a dynamic web page, a static web page, because it ends with .html. It'll show you something that looks like this. So again, as it says, if you omit parts of the URL, by default it should use HTTP. If you leave anything off the end, typically it'll look for index.html or index.htm or default.htm or default.html. Something like that. All right. Different ways that you can access a page on the internet. We're all used to going, if you want to Google something, what do? You type in google.com. That's it right here. Sometimes you're on a website and there's a thing there that says click here to get additional information. That's an example of what's right here. All right. Two ways to access a web page. Again, when you right mouse click, not on here because I'm in PowerPoint, but you're going to see something down here that will say view page source. All right, and that will allow you to do that. Naming recommendations, we'll follow these. We will create names for our folders and our files. We'll have basically just lowercase letters when at all possible, and use good names. So when you right mouse click and you choose view source code, this is the kind of thing you're going to see. Now you may look at this right now and it may make absolutely zero sense to you, but I can virtually guarantee that you'll be able to read it and understand it by the end of the semester. So again, if you want to view the source code, this is how you do it in different browsers. All right. A website that is easy to use. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that you can find what you're looking for and you can get information to do something. There's a rule that's called the 3-click rule, which says ideally on any website you can get to whatever you want to in 3 clicks. All right? Why? Because most users tend to be quite impatient. All right? So let's look at some guidelines to help be able to do this. Here's some guidelines for improving usability. All right, it says present as much critical information as possible above the fold. People look at above the fold and they're confused as to what that means. It's a newspaper term. If you remember the olden days, if you're old enough to remember a newspaper, you folded the newspaper in half. And above the fold, which was the stuff on the top half when you folded it. Group related items together and limit the number of groups on each page. Most people are in such a hurry to present so much information on a single page that the user gets lost. Include a header, typically a H1, that identifies the site and provides a navigation bar. Now, what I just said, not an H1, that would be a header that would be up on the top of the page. And use current navigation conventions. So have a logo on each page, and if you click the logo, have it go back to your home page. Have things like a shopping cart that will go to the shopping cart. Just things that people are used to using. All right. Here's the current browsers, and you'll notice this is not based on the ranking of usage. All right. Chrome is still first, but notice IE here is near the bottom. And what that means is they're talking here about cross-browser compatibility. Now, when I develop web pages, I develop them on Chrome. And then I go back and try to run them on some of the other browsers and on other versions of other browsers. All right? So it says, test your web pages on all the major browsers, including older versions. You might say, well, how do I get an older version? Typically, you'll have available to you, and you might have to go and Google it to find it, what are called emulators, which show what your page would look like on older browsers. This book will use HTML5, 5.1, CSS3 to give you the most modern features that will be allowed, at least on all the modern browsers. So, as it says, when you test your page in older browsers, one of the problems is IE didn't always play by the rules. So in older versions of IE, you might have to do things a little bit differently. All right. There are emulation tools that are provided by IE that lets you emulate older versions of the IE browser. Accessibility is an important concern. The more public you are, for instance, the federal government has to provide totally accessible websites. So people who are sight impaired, people who are hearing impaired, people who are motor impaired, where they maybe can't use a mouse, you have to provide a lot of different ways for them to get their information. If you're an e-commerce site and you're selling some kind of goods or services, you want to make sure everyone's money's good, right? And you want to make sure that anyone can use your site. There's also the Americans with Disabilities or ADA Act, which says basically you have to do this. Again, the more public you are, things like the government, you have to do that. There's a lot of different types of disabilities. I already mentioned visual. I had a student years ago who was legally blind. He had about 20% of his eyesight, and it was what is the word, generative disease, where it was going as he went on. We had to provide for him a monitor which was about 3 times as big at the time as what other students used. I have had blind people that have to use voice-activated things in the classroom. I have had deaf people, all right? People with motor, who have motor skills, like I mentioned, they may not be able to use a mouse. People who have cognitive problems, all right? People who might have any kind of personality or other kind of issue. If you want to learn more about this, you can go to webaim.org. The W3C, or the World Wide Web Consortium, has information on it also. And the W3 also has the WAI ARIA. You'll see this a lot as you work on websites, which is Web Accessibility Initiative, Accessible Rich Internet Apps, which are ways to make your website easier for people who have disabilities to use. And we don't use the word disability typically anymore. People who are challenged in one form or another. All right. three most popular search engines today: Google, Yahoo, and Bing. And it's Google with probably 80%, and the other 20% are being fought over by Yahoo and Bing. All right. The Murachs Books website on different devices. There it is on a phone. The portrait on a phone landscape. This might be, for example, it could be a tablet. It could be a desktop. It could be a laptop. All right. And the last thing they talk about in here in the chapter is responsive design. With responsive design, it refers to websites that will adapt to the screen size. So they will look good regardless of the medium in which they're being used. We will do that, and we will go through this. You will learn about media queries, scalable images, and flexible layouts, but we will also discuss and use something that's called Bootstrap to make our designs as we go on in here more and more responsive. So that pretty much is it for Chapter 1 of the text. So I'm going to stop here, and in just a minute I'm going to go on into Chapter 2, which is how to code, test, and validate a web page. So I'll be back with that shortly.